Welcome back, everyone. This is The Last Hike. For today's stories, I'm covering Karens who thought a park ranger was incompetent and that the warning signs were written for amateurs. Their refusal to listen would end with both of them collapsing on the canyon wall, unable to save themselves from the brutal reality of a 114-degree canyon. On July 14th, 2015, the South Kaibab Trail in Arizona's Grand Canyon looked like the perfect summer hike. 7 miles of stunning views from rim to river. But with nearly 4,800 feet of exposed descent and no shade, it's also one of the most dangerous trails in the country. And the hikers who get into the most trouble are rarely the ones who seem unprepared. Lynette Caulfield was 51 years old and lived in Scottsdale, Arizona. She worked in residential real estate, had built a comfortable life around her ability to read situations and make decisions quickly, and carried herself with the kind of confidence that comes from spending most of your adult life being right. She was organized, she was capable, and she had quietly extended both of those qualities into areas where they didn't actually apply. Her experience outdoors was real, but it was narrow. A guided hike in Sedona, a resort trail in Costa Rica, and a half-day canyon tour in New Mexico where a guide handled the route and the company handled everything else. Each of those trips had gone fine, and she had filed them away as evidence that she knew what she was doing outside. It's an easy mistake to make. The feeling of experience and actual experience aren't always the same thing. Renee Sorrento was 46, also from Scottsdale, and had been close with Lynette for nearly a decade after they met through a neighborhood social group. She ran half marathons on weekends, tracked her mileage carefully, and had built a strong part of her identity around being physically fit. That fitness had become something she referenced, consciously or not, whenever anyone implied she might not be capable of something. She had a tendency to trust her own judgment over cautionary advice, especially when that advice felt overly restrictive. Combined with Lynette's similar outlook, it created a friendship where skepticism was often reserved for everyone except each other, and that dynamic was going to matter a great deal on this particular day. The trip had been Lynette's idea from the beginning. She had come across photos of the South Kaibab Trail on a travel account she followed the wide ridgeline, the canyon walls dropping away in layers of red and orange on both sides, the Colorado River, visible as a thin green ribbon thousands of feet below, and almost immediately decided she wanted to see it for herself. Over the next few evenings, she read trail reviews, checked distances, and looked over maps. The picture that emerged seemed straightforward enough. A difficult hike, certainly, but not an unreasonable one for two active women who considered themselves experienced outdoors. The reviews weren't entirely reassuring. Many mentioned the heat, the need to start early, and the fact that South Kaibab had no reliable water sources along the trail. But those warnings didn't appear to change her mind. Like many hikers reading about a trail they've already fallen in love with, Lynette seems to have focused more on how to make the hike work than on reasons not to attempt it. When she brought the idea to Renee, the reaction was much the same. Renee looked at the photos, checked the mileage, and agreed that it seemed manageable. They settled on a trip in mid-July without giving much weight to the timing. Lynette had spent most of her life in Arizona and was accustomed to desert summers. And whether consciously or not, that familiarity may have made the canyon's July heat feel less intimidating than it actually was. They drove up from Scottsdale the day before, arriving at the South Rim in the late afternoon. The temperature at the rim was in the low 90s. Warm but not alarming, the kind of heat that felt familiar and manageable to two women who had spent their lives in the Arizona desert. The canyon itself was something else entirely. Photos had given them a sense of the scale, but standing at the rim and actually looking down at it was different. The layers of rock descending for what felt like forever. The river so far below it looked almost still. The trail switchbacking down the ridgeline in a way that made the whole thing look both enormous, from up here, entirely doable. They spent the evening walking along the rim, taking photos, and looking down at the route they planned to hike the following morning. The inner canyon was already in shadow by the time they arrived, which made it look cooler and more inviting than it actually was. I've stood on that rim before, and let me tell you, it's genuinely hard not to be fooled by it. The canyon hides what it is until you're actually already inside it. The forecast for the following day showed clear skies and a high of 94 degrees Fahrenheit at the rim. Lynette probably considered that reasonable for July in Arizona, packed 2 water bottles per person, roughly 80 ounces total between them, set an alarm for 7 a.m., and went to sleep. What she didn't look for, and may not have known to look for, was the inner canyon temperature projection sitting in a separate line of that same forecast. It read 114 degrees Fahrenheit by early afternoon. The rim and the canyon floor are two completely different climates separated by less than 10 miles of trail, and the forecast treats them as such. They arrived at the South Kaibab Trailhead at 8:20 a.m., later than Lynette had originally planned. Getting ready had taken longer than expected, and the trailhead was only accessible by park shuttle from the main visitor area area, which meant they had to wait for a bus that ran on its own schedule regardless of how early they had wanted to start. Lynette made a comment about the shuttle system being poorly managed while they waited. Renee agreed and said the whole operation felt disorganized for a place that charged what it charged to get in. The trailhead itself was busy. July brought enormous crowds to the Grand Canyon, and even at that hour, there were hikers adjusting packs, checking maps, and taking photos at the rim before heading down. Warning signs were posted prominently near the trail entrance large, clearly worded, "Impossible to miss." They said that summer hiking on South Kaibab was dangerous, that the trail had no water sources at any point along the route, that temperatures in the inner canyon regularly exceeded 110 degrees Fahrenheit, and that hikers were strongly advised not to attempt the full descent between May and September without significant preparation and experience. One sign specifically recommended turning around at Cedar Ridge, roughly 1.5 miles down during summer months, and described the return climb in afternoon heat as the primary cause of heat-related emergencies on the trail. Lynette glanced over the signs and said they were obviously written for people who'd never hiked before. Renee said the park probably put them up to avoid getting sued.
Reading this now, it's hard not to notice the irony. In a few hours, they would learn exactly why those signs were there.
A ranger was stationed at the trailhead that morning. He had been there since before sunrise, speaking with every group that came through, and the morning had already been long. July at the Grand Canyon meant a constant stream of visitors, many of them with plans that needed to be adjusted before they started down. He had redirected several groups to shorter routes already that morning, and a few had turned around entirely after speaking with him. He was calm and direct and had given this particular conversation enough times to know exactly what he needed to say and how much time he had to say it before people stopped listening. When Lynette and Renee approached the trail entrance, he greeted them and asked about their plan for the day. Lynette told him they were hiking down to the river and back. He asked how much water they were carrying. She told him 2 bottles each, about 80 ounces total between them. He told her that for a full descent and return on South Kaibab in July, that amount was significantly below what the conditions required. The general guidance for summer inner canyon hiking was a minimum of 1 liter per person per hour, and a full round trip to the river and back was a full day of hiking in temperatures that would exceed 110 degrees Fahrenheit by midday. Lynette told him they were from Arizona and knew how to handle heat. He didn't argue with that. He said inner canyon heat in July was a different category from surface desert heat. The canyon walls trapped and radiated everything the sun had put into them since sunrise. There was no shade anywhere on the South Kaibab, and the return climb was where people got into serious trouble because by the time they started back up, they were already depleted from the descent and the heat had been building for hours. He told her he had personally responded to medical emergencies involving fit, experienced people on this trail in July, and that fitness didn't change what 113 degrees Fahrenheit did to a body that had run out of water. She told him she appreciated the information and stepped toward the trail. He moved slightly, not blocking her, and told her specifically that the NPS recommendation was not to hike below Cedar Ridge between May and September, and that he was asking them to consider turning around at that point and saving the full descent for a cooler time of year.
Cedar Ridge was still a worthwhile hike. The views were spectacular, and they would be back at the rim well before the heat became dangerous. In fact, a lot of people turn around and never feel like they missed a thing.
Renee said Cedar Ridge was barely a mile down, and they hadn't driven 3 hours to walk a mile and turn around. Lynette said she had hiked in conditions like this before and was perfectly capable of assessing her own limits without assistance. The ranger said he wasn't questioning their fitness. He was telling them that extreme heat was a physical condition that affected everyone regardless of fitness level, and that the trail had no water and no shade for the entire descent, which meant
I don't know what else he could have done. He wasn't trying to ruin their hike. He was trying to keep them from having the kind of day that people end up writing reports about later.
Lynette looked at him for a moment. Then she told him that if the trail was genuinely too dangerous to hike, it should be closed, and since it wasn't, she would appreciate it if he stepped aside. And then she told him she found it remarkable that a national park employed people specifically to stand at trailheads and discourage visitors from using the trails they had paid to access. The ranger said nothing further. He noted their description and start time in his log and watched them begin the descent. The first section of the South Kaibab is immediately and genuinely spectacular, and that's part of what makes it dangerous. The trail drops along an open ridgeline from the moment you leave the trailhead, and within the first quarter mile, the canyon is falling away on both sides of you in a way that makes it almost impossible to focus on anything except the view. Layer after layer of red and orange and pale cream-colored rock descends toward the river far below, and the scale of it is the kind of thing that takes a few minutes to actually process. Most people stop constantly in the first mile just to look around, and Lynette and Renee were no different. The morning air at the rim was still in the mid-80s when they started, which felt warm but entirely manageable. The trail was busy with other hikers, the atmosphere was energetic, and the physical effort of the descent was easy, in the way that going downhill always is when your legs are fresh and the grade is gentle. Lynette took photos frequently and said the ranger had been completely unnecessary and that the trail was exactly what she had expected. Renee said she felt great and that the views were even better in person than they had looked online. They passed Cedar Ridge, the specific point the ranger had named, without stopping or discussing it. Lynette noted it and kept walking. Renee said turning around there would have been a waste of the entire trip. They kept moving down. As they dropped below the rim, the temperature began climbing in a way that was gradual enough to feel normal. It just felt like the sun was getting stronger as the morning went on, which seemed entirely reasonable for July in Arizona. What was actually happening was that they were descending into a different climate, one where the canyon walls on either side had been absorbing heat since sunrise and were now radiating it back from every surface, where the air had no moisture to carry heat away, and where the temperature was rising roughly 2 to 3 degrees for every 1,000 feet of elevation they lost. They couldn't feel that math happening. They just felt warm, which felt fine. They passed a couple coming back up, about 2 miles down, both of them flushed and moving slowly, not talking, focused entirely on the trail in front of them. Lynette said they looked like they'd started too late in the day. Renee said some people just didn't pace themselves properly.
What neither of them seemed to consider was that those two people coming back up, exhausted, flushed, not talking, were a preview. That was going to be them in a few hours, except by then, it would be much worse.
Water consumption had started without either of them tracking it carefully. The heat made drinking feel automatic. A sip here, a sip there, whenever the mouth felt dry, and neither of them was counting how much was left or calculating how far they still had to go. By the time they reached the Tonto platform, roughly 4.5 miles down and about 3,200 feet below the rim, the morning had given way to full midday heat, and the trail had become something noticeably different from what it had been at the top. The temperature at that elevation was well above 100 degrees Fahrenheit, and still climbing. The inner canyon amplified everything. The rock on either side of the trail radiated heat that had been building since before they arrived, the air was dry enough that sweat evaporated almost the moment it formed, and the pale sandstone beneath their feet reflected heat upward from below as well as down from above. There was no direction that wasn't hot. The descent had felt easy, and that was the problem. Going down 3,200 feet of elevation in extreme heat depletes the body in ways that don't announce themselves clearly while you're moving. The legs are working constantly to control the descent, the cardiovascular system is running harder than it feels like it is, and the fluid loss from sweating in that kind of heat is faster than the thirst signal can keep up with. Both women had been losing water faster than they were replacing it for hours, and neither of them knew it because the dry air had been evaporating their sweat before they could feel how much they were producing. Lynette had become quieter over the last mile. The commentary about the views and the other hikers had stopped, replaced by a focus on the trail immediately ahead. She checked her water bottle during a rest stop and didn't say anything about what she saw. Renee said her legs felt heavier than she had expected. Lynette told her it was the elevation change and that they'd feel better once they turned around and got moving again. They rested briefly at the Tonto platform. The Colorado River was visible below, closer than it had been from the rim, but still a significant distance down. Lynette looked at it for a moment. By then, reaching the river had become more than just a hiking objective. It was the plan she had defended to Renee, to the ranger, and to herself. She didn't say anything about changing course, and Renee didn't suggest it. They kept descending. They reached the river corridor at approximately 11:50 a.m. The temperature at the bottom was 113 degrees Fahrenheit. There was no shade anywhere near the trail. The Colorado River was right there, wide and green and moving, but the water wasn't safe to drink without treatment equipment. Neither of them had brought, and standing next to it in 113 degrees Fahrenheit heat with no shade provided almost no relief at all. They stopped for about 10 minutes. Lynette sat down on a rock and didn't get up quickly. Renee finished the last of her water and held the empty bottle for a moment without saying anything about it. They had roughly 7 miles of trail ahead of them to get back to the rim.
Think about that for a second. They were sitting at the bottom of the Grand Canyon in the middle of July with empty water bottles and a 7-mile climb back to the top.
The ranger had told them exactly how much water they needed. He had told them exactly what the heat would be. He had told them exactly what the return climb would cost them. and they were sitting at the bottom with nothing left, about to find out that every single thing he said was true. After a few minutes, Lynette got to her feet and said they needed to start back. Something in her voice had changed. Renee seemed to notice it too. Without saying much else, they started up the trail. The first 20 minutes of the return climb were manageable in the way that the beginning of something always is. They were moving, they had a direction, and the immediate physical effort of climbing gave them something to focus on besides the heat. But the return on South Kaibab in July is a fundamentally different experience from the descent, and the difference becomes clear very quickly. Going up generates body heat through exertion, on top of the ambient temperature that's already there. The canyon walls on either side of the trail had been absorbing heat since before sunrise, and were now radiating it back at full intensity. The trail surface itself was hot enough to feel through the soles of their shoes. There was no breeze, no cloud cover, no shade at any point on the route, and no water anywhere on the trail for the entire 7 miles back to the rim. The body's ability to cool itself through sweating depends entirely on having enough fluid to produce sweat, and both women had run out of fluid at the bottom. Their cooling systems were running on empty in the hottest part of the day on the most exposed trail in the canyon. Within 30 minutes of starting back up, both women were in trouble they weren't fully recognizing yet. Lynette's pace had dropped significantly. She was stopping every few hundred feet rather than every half mile, and the stops were lasting longer each time. Her face was deeply flushed, and when Renee looked at her during one of those stops, she noticed that Lynette wasn't sweating anymore, which in 113 degrees Fahrenheit heat meant something specific and serious was happening. The body stops sweating when it no longer has the fluid to produce it, and when sweating stops in extreme heat, core temperature rises without any mechanism to slow it down. That transition from heat exhaustion to heat stroke is the point of no return without immediate intervention. The cruel part is that people experiencing it often don't even realize what's happening. Lynette said she felt dizzy during one of the stops and sat down on the trail. She said she just needed a minute. Renee sat down next to her and waited. Renee was dealing with her own version of the same problem. She was still on her feet, but her thinking had become slow and unreliable in a way she wasn't fully aware of. She kept asking Lynette questions about how far they had come and how far they still had to go, questions she should have been able to answer herself, and when Lynette's responses became slow and didn't quite track, Renee didn't immediately register that as an emergency. Her own cognition was compromised enough that she was processing what she was seeing more slowly than she normally would have. The conclusion she reached, that Lynette needed a few minutes to rest and would be okay, was the wrong one, but it was the only one she had the capacity to reach at that point. Other hikers passed them on the trail. A few slowed down and asked if they were okay. Lynette waved them on and said they were fine. Renee didn't respond to one group at all, which the hikers noticed and remembered later. The window for an early emergency call was passing with every group that moved on. Approximately 2.1 miles into the return climb, Lynette stopped walking and did not start again. She sat down on the trail, said she needed a minute, and then became very difficult to communicate with. Her responses to Renee's questions were slow and disconnected. She answered questions that hadn't been asked and didn't answer the ones that had. She was no longer sweating. Her skin was hot and dry to the touch. She was not oriented to where she was or what was happening around her. In cases like this, confusion isn't just a symptom, it's evidence that the heat is beginning to overwhelm the body's ability to protect itself. Renee sat with her. She did not call for help. She waited for Lynette to recover, which was the wrong response, but Renee's own body temperature was elevated. Her fluid deficit was severe, and her ability to think clearly and act decisively had been eroding for the last hour without her realizing it. She was sitting in 111 degrees Fahrenheit heat with no water next to someone who was in the process of dying, and she didn't have the cognitive capacity left to fully understand what she was looking at. A group of hikers coming down the trail found them approximately 15 minutes later. Lynette was unresponsive. Renee was conscious but confused and couldn't give clear answers about how long they had been sitting or how much water they had consumed. One member of the group had a satellite communicator and sent an emergency alert immediately. Others in the group had water and began giving it to Renee and attempting to get some into Lynette, but Lynette was unresponsive and could not drink. They used wet clothing to try to cool her skin. The temperature on the trail at that point was 111 degrees Fahrenheit, and there was no shade within reach. The emergency alert was received, and a response was initiated, but reaching the two women was not straightforward. Their location, approximately 2.5 miles above the river and 2.4 miles below the rim, was accessible only on foot or by helicopter, and summer heat in the inner canyon creates air density conditions that limit what a helicopter can carry and when it can safely operate. A ground response team was deployed from the rim, while an air assessment was conducted simultaneously. The The hikers who found them stayed on scene and kept doing what they could. Here's just the revised ending. The ground response team reached them approximately 55 minutes after the alert was sent. By that point, Lynette had been unresponsive for over an hour in direct sun, with no cooling and no hydration, and her core temperature when the team reached her was recorded at 108 degrees Fahrenheit. At that temperature, organ damage is not a possibility, it's a certainty. The question is only how much has already occurred and whether any of it can be reversed. Renee was still conscious when the team arrived, but just barely. She had been sitting in the same heat, with the same empty bottles, next to someone she couldn't help, for nearly an hour. Her body had been running on nothing for a long time by then. Lynette Caulfield was evacuated by helicopter after the ground team stabilized her enough for transport. She did not regain consciousness. She was pronounced dead that evening. Renee Sorrento was evacuated shortly after by the ground team. She was unresponsive by the time she was loaded for transport and did not recover. She was pronounced dead the following morning. The coroner determined that both Lynette Caulfield and Renee Sorrento died from exertional heat stroke. Contributing factors for both included severe dehydration, prolonged exposure to extreme ambient temperatures exceeding 110 degrees Fahrenheit, physical exertion during the return ascent, and the complete absence of any cooling mechanism or hydration during the critical period following the onset of symptoms. Lynette's core temperature at the time of evacuation was recorded at 108 degrees Fahrenheit. Renee's was 106 degrees Fahrenheit. The cases were ruled accidental. Evidence recovered included Lynette's phone, which contained time-stamped photos placing both women at the river corridor at 11:47 a.m. and on the return trail at 12:09 p.m. GPS data from Renee's fitness tracker confirmed their pace, their route, and the exact point at which movement stopped. The Trailhead entry log contained both names with a recorded start time of 8:34 a.m. The ranger's log noted the time of their interaction and his description of the water they were carrying, which was consistent with what the responding team found at the scene: 2 empty bottles between them, both dry.